Since we were on the topic of routing, I just wanted to spend a couple more minutes talking about the HTML helper methods that helped us generate outgoing URLs. So in the previous lesson, we took a look at line number 10 in the index.cshtml file that was generated automatically by the scaffolding. And this call to action link created a new anchor tag with the text create new, and it had an href property set to /products/create, and that took us obviously to the screen where we could create a new product. Scrolling down, we looked in lines 32 through 34, and these are a little bit more interesting because they have not only the triple hyperlinks that were next to each product in our database in a tabular format, the links edit, details, and delete, but we also got to see this anonymous object that was being passed in as one of the arguments. And we said at the time that we needed to pass an ID to all three of these, to the edit, the details, and the delete, so that it knew which product to edit, to view the details of, or to delete. And so we did that through the creation of an anonymous object that had the properties that we need. It just had an ID product, and I said that it took that and it used it in our default route that was generated automatically for us, and it used it, matched it up with the ID segment of that URL pattern, and that's how it was able to create that long URL. So /products/edit/ ABCD123, you know, the GUID that came after it. Okay? So, route values, like the ones we created right here, are utilized by the action link method to create the correct segments for outgoing hyperlinks. If you take a look at this version of the action link method, you can see there's 10 versions of this action link method overloaded, and this particular overload has as the third input parameter something called route values of type object. And you can see that at the very bottom it defines what route values are, since we're in that parameters area there, and it says basically route values are an object that contains the parameters for a route. The parameters are retrieved through reflection by examining the properties of the object. The object is typically created by using object initializer syntax off to the side of the screen there. Alright, so we're basically just creating an object that will be utilized as a dictionary of values, and that dictionary of values will be compared against the routes that are defined. And whenever a route is chosen to be used to generate an outgoing hyperlink, it'll use the route values and fill in any matches. So in this case, again, we have an anonymous object with a property of ID, and it's matched up with the ID segment of the URL pattern that was created for this map route. Okay. However, if we pass in a key that does not match a segment name that's defined in that URL pattern, then it will convert that to that name value pair to a query string value. So, for example, let's go here, and I'm just going to go comma some such equals 456. All right. Some such is just a property name on the anonymous object that I made up off the top of my head. It's not represented in the URL pattern. In fact, it's not represented anywhere else in our project. So what does the routing system do with this as it generates an outgoing link? Well, let's take a look here. It will, and we'll click on that link, the first one. Everything looks normal. So we have /product/edit, then we have the long GUID right there, and then after the GUID there's a question mark, and here we have some such equals 456. So remember, the question mark from our previous work in web forms indicates that we're working with a query string. Query strings are just extra values that are appended onto the URL that can be plucked off on the request side. So in other words, what I can do here in my products controller in the edit The get version of our edit method is go like right here in line number 75, 74, somewhere in that ballpark. And I can do something like the following. Var my value equals request dot query string, and then I'll pass in the key some such. All right, and I can even just do this in a more shorthanded way by my other value equals request dot query. Whoops, I don't even need the query string. I can just do this. I don't think that's as expressive. As you know, I like to type more to make sure that everything is obvious, but you don't have to do that. And now if we set a breakpoint in line number 78 and run the application, and we click on that first edit link, you can see how we were able to grab off those values 456, 456, and then we can do whatever we want with them inside of that that edit action result method. And so this is just a way that you can pass values between routes, I guess, in your application. You can still use query strings. In fact, again, just to emphasize this, whenever you use route values and you define a key value that does not have a match inside of the routes that you've defined, then it's going to use that as the name and then the value property for the query string. All right, and as I said in the previous lesson, let's talk about this anonymous object for just a moment. Obviously, this utilizes something called an anonymous object, an anonymous type. We talk about this in the object-oriented C# course on LearnVisualStudio.net. It's a way of quickly creating an object that has all the right properties but doesn't need a formal definition. So we don't have to go off in another file and create a route values class. All right, we're just able to define it on the fly, say I just need an object with these properties. Don't worry about the class. Don't worry about what type it is. It's anonymous. Just use it. Okay, and it's pretty convenient. Obviously, we're able to just new it up right here without any formal definition. However, it's not strongly typed. It's weakly typed. So whenever you use anything that's of type object, you're using a weak type. Now this is probably just okay most of the time, but generally speaking, weakly typed code is dangerous because you won't really know whether it works or not until runtime. And you may not uncover an issue before your application is deployed live and some end user finds it for you, and you don't want that. It makes you look unprofessional. Okay, so if you want to create a strongly typed route value dictionary, which is ultimately what we're creating here and trying to pass in, what you can do is something like this. Let me just paste in a second version of this create method up here. So here we have our first version of our create method. I'm just going to paste in a second version of it. And in fact, I'm just going to add a line break so we can clearly see these. Whoops, yeah. Okay, and so you can see here, instead of creating an anonymous object, I'm actually newing up a new instance of the route value dictionary. Now, admittedly, inside of that, I'm creating new anonymous objects to indicate the locale and the year, but we are doing what's ultimately being done for us behind the scenes, which is creating a new route value dictionary. Let's go ahead and run the application and look at the URL that's generated. All right, and as I hover my mouse cursor over the create version 3, you can see that after the word create, there's a query string question mark operator, and it sets the locale equal to English US, and then it uses the ampersand character. So whenever you have multiple route values that don't match a route defined in or a URL pattern, a URL segment pattern item, then it will just concatenate those together using your typical query string concatenation, the ampersand character. So you have two name value pairs there that are concatenated together. Okay, version 3 of this URL that we just created here seems a little bit like overkill. You'd probably wind up doing something like this, and let me just go ahead and go below this with something like that. Let me add another line break. and then later on you would wind up doing something like this. So here we're just going to new up a route value dictionary and give it the dictionary that we created in this razor code block. So here we create just a new dictionary of T key, T value, the key being a string. The value can be anything we want it to be. And here we're just adding first, second, and third as dictionary items for our route value dictionary. So now when we run the application, the URL will look pretty funky, but hopefully it reinforces how this works. Look at that URL as we're hovering over it. So after the create segment, there's a query string, question mark operator, and then we have 3 name value pairs all concatenated together with the ampersand character. Okay? So and then obviously could do anything we want to with those in the action result method for create in this case. So I just wanted to remove some of the mystery around the values that you're going to see passed into the action link method as we go through the remainder of this scaffolded example. And you're going to see similar sorts of nomenclature used for other HTML helper methods in this example. So I just wanted to point that out, especially those methods that create outgoing URLs. So just to recap, the route values you passed in represent a dictionary of values that are mapped to a specific route defined in your routeconfig.cs. So when it's possible, it'll use the route values that you pass in to build a URL with the values that you pass into the proper segments. And when it can't find a match against the URL pattern, then it's just going to add those name value pairs as query string arguments, which you can just access easily using the request object that's created for you by the ASP.NET runtime. Okay, so hopefully all that makes sense. Continue on the next lesson by dissecting this example. See you there. Thanks.